All right, guys, welcome. I'm going to do a book overview today of a book called The God Who Is There by Francis Schaeffer. And I'm going to do it actually in two parts because it's going to be very long. And the reason why it's going to be so long is because I'm going to sort of interject some of my own illustrations and sort of thoughts throughout as we go. And hopefully I'll make those clear. I'll be able to distinguish for you guys what is my own thought and what is the thought from the book. But I wanted to do a book overview of this book because I think it's incredibly applicable to where we are as a culture and society today. Our society is changing incredibly rapidly. This country in particular, the United States, is changing at a rate never before seen in its history. Not only do kids think differently than their parents, especially when it comes to finding truth, but younger siblings even think differently than their older siblings. That's how fast the change is moving. That's how fast worldviews are shifting in our country right now. And so I think this time calls for some serious reflection on how we got to where we are and what we as Christians can do about it, how we can respond, how we can impact the culture, how we can strengthen our own faith through the Holy Spirit. And I want to read you a passage from a very influential Christian thinker. The present chasm between the generations has been brought about almost entirely by a change in the concept of truth. Wherever you look today, the new concept holds the field. The consensus about us is almost monolithic, whether you review the arts, literature, or simply read the news. On every side, you can feel the stranglehold of this new methodology. It is like suffocating in a particularly bad London fog. And just as fog cannot be kept out by walls or doors, so this consensus comes in around us until the room we live in is no longer unpolluted, and yet we hardly realize what has happened. The tragedy of our situation today is that men and women are being fundamentally affected by the new way of looking at truth, and yet they have never even analyzed the drift which has taken place. Young people from Christian homes are brought up in the old framework of truth. Then they are subjected to the modern framework. In time, they become confused because they do not understand the alternatives with which they are being presented. Confusion becomes bewilderment, and before long they are overwhelmed. This is unhappily true not only of young people, but of many pastors, Christian educators, evangelists, and missionaries as well. So this change in the concept of the way we come to knowledge and truth is the most crucial problem, as I understand it, facing Christianity today. End quote. Now, that sounds a lot like what's going on right now in our society, in my opinion. But this quote wasn't from 2020. Or 2019, or even from this century. This quote was originally written over 50 years ago by Francis Schaeffer in his book, The God Who Is There. And yet it is as relevant today, I would say, as it was back then. And it's all the more relevant because how quickly change comes at us these days. It's almost like on a daily basis, we have something new coming at us here. Schaeffer was an incredible prophetic voice for the church. He could see not only what was happening in the culture, but he could see where it was going. And so his writings today look to us very prescient. Like he could really see really far down the road. And this really speaks to his intellectual and spiritual gifts, that what he wrote back then is still relevant to us today. So I want to first start with some background on Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was born in 1912 in Germantown, Pennsylvania. And he was born into a secular working class family. So, excuse me, coffee break. In spite of his intellect, he was always easily able to connect with the working class man. In high school, he started reading philosophy, but he realized as he was reading it that it couldn't answer the deepest philosophical questions that he had. It couldn't bring about a holy, fully orbed, consistent worldview that mankind needed. And so he started reading the Bible on his own and found the answers to the deeper questions that couldn't be arrived at through secular philosophy. But he became depressed because, as far as he knew, he was the only one that believed the Bible as it was written. He didn't know any other Christians. But then one day he heard a street preacher and heard him preaching about the classic historic Christian faith. And immediately Schaeffer committed his life to ministry. And so he knew he would have to go to college to do that. But his parents didn't want him to do that. They were working class people, and so they wanted him to learn a trade to make sure that he was able to have a good, secure job. But Schaeffer was insistent, and he was sincere. They could tell he was sincere. So in spite of their wishes, they let him go to college to study to be a minister. So he graduated from college in 1935 and then enrolled at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, where he studied under guys like Cornelius Van Til and J. Gresham Machen. And then he transferred to Faith Theological Seminary, where he eventually graduated from in 1938. And after that, he pastored for many years in Pennsylvania and in Missouri. And in 1955, he moved to Switzerland with his wife and his kids and founded L'Abri Fellowship, which was basically a sort of a philosophical seminar and Christian fellowship center. And it attracted many deeper thinkers who were unsatisfied with the current state of philosophy and their own worldviews, and Schaeffer would present them with the truth of the gospel. And then eventually, a lot of branches of L'Abri would be started all over Europe and in the US and Canada. Schaeffer became a prolific writer, writing a total of 22 books. He wrote The God Who Is There, obviously. He wrote Escape from Reason and He Is There and He Is Not Silent. And those three books comprise the Schaeffer trilogy, as it is called, because they all sort of overlap and touch on a lot of the same subjects. And they're probably his three most influential books. He wrote a book called True Spirituality in 1971. So if you really want a comprehensive look at Schaeffer's thought system and his system of belief, that's the book you want to read. He wrote Genesis in Space and Time, which argued for a true historic space-time fall of Adam and Eve and argued that it is essential to the Christian faith. And then his magnum opus was a video series he produced called How Should We Then Live?, where he walks through Western history since the birth of the church, exploring what the foundations of society were at these different places and times, and whether they had a biblical basis or an unbiblical basis, and the result of that as it played out through history. And Francis Schaeffer ultimately died of lymphoma in 1984. So in this video, I want to review book 1 of his trilogy, The God Who Is There. And the quote from earlier was from the very beginning of the book. And he starts by describing this titanic worldview shift, which has happened in the Western world, even by the time that he was writing this. And so in the first part of the century, in the Western world, and even further back in Europe, a shift in presuppositions changed the way that people thought about arriving at truth. It changed both how people thought about epistemology, how you can know what you can know, and methodology, how you go about seeking that truth, the ways that you try to learn and inform yourself. So before this change, whether someone was a Christian or not, they would have almost always shared many of the same presuppositions as the Christian and with each other. Namely, the foundational laws of logic, things like A is A and A is not non-A, so classical logic, laws of non-contradiction. This was a foundational presupposition for how people came to knowledge and truth. Naturally, this ties into morality, it ties into metaphysics or your view of reality. And so if you said something was right or wrong, a universal morality was assumed, even if you disagreed on some of the specifics of what that morality entailed. A universal morality was assumed. People basically thought you could know certain things about reality by applying the laws of logic, by applying the scientific method, because the basic presupposition behind all of this was that the universe was created in an orderly fashion because God is a God of order. Even if people didn't believe that, they still retained the basic presuppositions that had led to things like modern science and the scientific method. But what Schaeffer saw as a shift in society was that all people that have abandoned the biblical basis for these presuppositions, they were beginning to abandon the presuppositions as well. So they abandoned the biblical revelation, and then they started to abandon the presuppositions that were built on top of that biblical revelation. So for a long time, they had the presuppositions that were built on top of the revelation, without the biblical basis. And they realized that since they didn't have the biblical basis, what were they doing with these presuppositions up here? And so they started to jettison those and start thinking in a different way. And so he says it like this, quote, "The shift has been tremendous. 30 or more years ago, you could have said such a thing as, 'This is true,' or 'This is right,' and you would have been on everybody's wavelength. People may or may not have thought out their beliefs consistently, but everyone would have been talking to each other as though the idea of antithesis," and by that he means, A is not non-A, classical logic, "was correct," end quote. But not so much anymore. People don't think that way. And we see the fruit of this in the 20th century. When you share your faith with a college student, and the 20th and into the 21st century, actually, when you share your faith with a college student, the most common responses you get are not things like, "Well, you are right or wrong because of A, B, or C." Now, you do get that sometimes, but a much more common response in my experience is, "I'm glad that works for you." How many of you that have shared your faith have heard that? I had one guy tell me, "I'm more of a crystals guy," because he was really into all this new age stuff. And the interesting thing about how he said it is he said it exactly like you would say something about like your favorite flavor of ice cream, right? To him, it was a matter of preference. This was not a matter of, it's either true or not true. It's like, this works for me. I'm glad that works for you. I'm doing my own thing over here. And you don't have to think too hard about how this sort of thought process has affected our culture's view of sex and gender. We also see it in the modern social justice movement to some extent when it comes to intersectionality. And the movement is based on something called standpoint epistemology. And that is a form of subjectivism. It's a form of postmodernism. And basically it says that depending on what group you belong to, and how many of these groups you belong to, specifically victim groups, you can see more, and you can see more accurately than people who don't belong to these victim groups. All that to say that all that Schaeffer has said has produced the fruit that is our modern society. And Schaeffer says that if the church had realized what was happening, we could have done something about it. But the church was, and in my opinion, continues to be several steps behind where the culture is. And so Schaeffer says this, quote, "It was indeed unfortunate that our Christian thinkers in the time before the shift took place and the chasm was fixed did not teach and preach with a clear grasp of presuppositions. Had they done this, they would not have been taken by surprise, and they could have helped young people to face their difficulties. The really foolish thing is that even now, years after the shift is complete, many Christians still do not know what is happening. And this is because they are still not being taught the importance of thinking in terms of presuppositions, especially concerning truth," end quote. So, knowing how people think is critically important. It's not, first and foremost, a discussion about facts. Now, you realize everybody has access to the same facts. We all live in the same universe. We all have access, ultimately, to the same information. And so you can think of reality kind of like a puzzle. And the facts are like the puzzle pieces. But we don't put them all in the same place. Because our worldview is like the picture on the back of the box that tells us where to put those pieces, right? And so, according to what we think the world should be like, according to the picture on the back of our box, that's how we're going to fit those pieces in. And so what we as Christians can do is we can come along and say, "Hey, look, it looks like you've got the wrong picture on the back of your box. You see how that piece isn't quite fitting so easily? Well, let me show you the real picture." And those pieces that you've been trying to shoehorn in there, they actually go like this, and it's going to fit really nicely. And so Schaeffer calls this shift in thinking in Western culture, he calls it the line of despair. The line of despair. So before the shift, people worked on fundamentally biblical presuppositions, even if they didn't have a basis for those presuppositions. But after the shift, they crossed this line of despair because they lost the ability to have absolutes, real morality, meaning, even a good base for knowledge. But this shift didn't happen all at once. It sort of trickled down through culture, through different disciplines within culture, eventually reaching others and eventually reaching the general populace. And so that's the basis basically for the rest of the book. In the rest of the book, Schaeffer traces this trend throughout these different aspects of culture. And then he demonstrates the Christian solution to it, and finally how we as Christians can communicate that truth in such a wishy-washy postmodernist culture. So how does this despair manifest itself? Well, the main mode of thought in Schaeffer's day, and to a great extent today still, is something called rationalism. Now, rationalism is different than rationality. Rationality is just using reasoning, using logic to reach certain conclusions. Rationalism is using your reasoning as a basis to begin your thinking, to begin your thought process, and to try to build brick by brick a solid worldview. Or in other words, to build a unity out of all of the particulars of the universe. You take all these facts, you want to try to build a coherent unity out of them, starting from nothing but yourself. That is rationalism. And so before the line of despair, this rationalism was an optimistic rationalism. People were confident that they could eventually find this sort of unifying factor of reality starting from themselves. But below the line, people have become pessimistic rationalists. They've abandoned the idea of being able to find this unified view of reality. And so, because of that, a lot of people have abandoned the classic forms of thought, like antithesis. And that's another way of saying classical logic, A or non-A. So we've been left with this pragmatic relativism. Hence, you get answers to, the gospel like, well, I'm glad that works for you. So when we go out and share the gospel, and people listen to us, this is my own thought now, we interpret that as people being open to the gospel. And sometimes those people are. But sometimes I wonder if really they're letting us talk, not because they're open to the gospel, but because they're not threatened by it, because they don't think in terms of antithesis. You see? Like, they don't think of it as an either or kind of situation. They think of it as, oh, this is what works for this guy or this girl, but that's not going to work for me. Or maybe I can take a thing from that, like, oh, love your neighbor. Oh, I like that. Thanks. Bye, Christian. And so they sort of customize their religion. That is the 21st century religion, right? It's totally customizable. And we love customizable things in our culture. So that's what we do with religion. That's what we do with ultimate truth, some of us. So let's move on in the book. Then Schaeffer talks about the first aspect of culture to move below the line of despair, and that is philosophy. The philosopher that opened the door to this way of thinking was the German philosopher Hegel, and he's a pretty good-looking guy. And Hegel's big innovation was a shift from linear thinking, cause and effect, antithesis, to synthesis. And it goes like this. You have an idea, your thesis, and then you have its opposite, the antithesis. And instead of choosing between the two, you smush them together and you get what's called a synthesis. Then you take that synthesis, that becomes your new thesis, posited against an antithesis, and you get a new synthesis. And you just keep repeating that process. And so that may seem a little vague, but maybe I can give you an example. This isn't Schaeffer's example, but one that I thought of. There was a biblical scholar who picked up on this named F.C. Bauer, and he was a New Testament scholar. And his contention was that in early Christianity, you had competing types of Christianity. You had more of a Jewish Christianity, which was sort of more legalistic, more law-based, and more of a grace-based Christianity, more of a Gentile Christianity. And these are kind of represented by Peter and Paul. Paul was a Jew, whatever. In any case, so the thesis was this law-based gospel, and the antithesis was a grace-based gospel. And what we have in the New Testament, he says, or in some parts of the New Testament, is a synthesis of these two views. And so that's the Christianity that we know today, according to Bauer. So that's kind of how Hegel's dialectic works. So in terms of truth, instead of antithesis, we have a synthesis. And that's a big shift in how people thought. So Hegel opened the door, but the first major thinker below the line of despair was Soren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard was the father of existentialism. Now, he was a Christian, but his thinking led below the line of despair, as we're going to find out. So to help you visualize it, here's this diagram right here. And those steps on the side represent different aspects of culture. And that is the new way of thinking seeping down into these different aspects of culture, with the first stair being philosophy. And so the reason Kierkegaard is the first below the line is because of his idea of a leap of faith. In order for your faith to be genuine, you have to have it completely separated from rationality. Okay, it had to be blind. Have you ever heard any objections along these lines that to be a Christian you have to check your brain at the door, that you can't use any reasoning when thinking about God, that it's just a leap of faith? Well, that kind of comes from Kierkegaard. That conception of Christianity, and some Christians believe it, that conception of Christianity comes from Kierkegaard. And so there is no way to access this upper level based on reason. It has to be blind faith. There's no way to access it through your mental faculty, through rationalism alone. And so rationalism has failed to provide answers in this upper level. So the answers to the big questions only come from this leap. And so this existentialism led to two branches of existentialism, religious and secular. And some of the secular thinkers were Karl Jaspers, Jean-Paul Sartre, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and Martin Heidegger. And they basically taught that in order to validate yourself, to give your life meaning, you had to have a first order experience. You had to have an experience that validated your life and your existence amidst this world of pessimism and apparent meaninglessness. And so hopefully you can see some of the problems with this. First of all, an experience, what does that mean? That could be anything. When would you know that you had it? What if you never have it? What if my experience is something that somebody else would consider evil, and their experience would consist of stopping what I'm doing? How can life be worth living if I'm basing my value only on something that happened like 20 years ago? What would be the continuing purpose of my life, the continuing meaning of it? The existentialists have gone below the line of despair. And so there can be nothing rational about their ultimate purpose and meaning. But these existentialists have hit upon something, Schaeffer says. They can't describe it because they don't have categories for it, and they're just working for themselves as a starting point. But what they're experiencing and seeking is in line with the image of God, or what Francis Schaeffer calls the mannishness of man. And so if we start with God and his revelation, we can explain things like the beauty of a rose or falling in love. The existentialist, on the other hand, does not have that option. Schaeffer says this, quote, "Lovers on the left bank of the Seine in Paris experience the mannishness of man when they fall in love and yet cry because they do not believe love exists. If I met any of these, I would put my hand gently on their shoulders and say, 'You are separated from God if you do not accept Christ as your Savior. But at this moment, you understand something real about the universe. Or though your system may say love does not exist, your own experience shows that it does. They have not touched the personal God who exists, but for a fleeting moment, they have touched the existence of true personality in their love." End quote. And so here we see the presuppositional nature coming out very clearly in Schaeffer's thinking. But we also can see how it's different from another presuppositionalist, someone like Cornelius Van Til. Schaeffer says that these people have discovered something true and genuine about the universe, whereas a guy like Van Til would say, no, they really haven't, because they're still not thinking of it in terms of it being a revelation of God, natural revelation. So they still don't know it truly yet. Anyway, that's a simplification of the difference there, but I don't know, maybe I'll do a deep dive later into Van Til or comparing different types of presuppositionalism. That might not be interesting to anybody but me, though. We'll see. In any case, the second aspect of culture to fall below the line was art. So philosophy only affected a small amount of the population, but with art, it started to go kind of more mainstream. These were people that common people knew. Some incredibly influential artists that fell below this line of despair included Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Picasso. And so here's how Schaeffer describes their art. Quote, "What the philosopher was trying to do within the scope of the whole universe, they now tried to do on a limited scale on their canvases. As they crossed the threshold of the line of despair, they began a desperate search to find a universal that would give them back reality, something more than just particulars." And Van Gogh and Gauguin died in despair after being unable to achieve this universal based on mankind as a rational base. And Picasso's abstraction left him unable to communicate with his audience. And another interesting thing was that there is a particular school of art called Dadaism. Now, Dadaism was a discipline of art that was based completely on chance. They tried to base everything, every tiny little thing, on chance as much as possible. The name Dadaism was even entirely random. It actually means rocking horse in French, and it was chosen entirely at random by pulling a random word out of a French dictionary. That was the basis for that school of art. And so that's art below the line of despair. Now, the third and fourth steps below the line were music and general culture. And the theme here is that you start to see more and more of the relativism and apparent meaninglessness. Music concrete, for example, was just random sounds that were heavily distorted. So you weren't really sure what you were listening to, and that was kind of the point. There's an author named Henry Miller who would write profane sexual material, thereby destroying the meaning of sex. And very interestingly, on this note of sex, Schaeffer talks about homosexuality, and what he says back then describes our current culture to a T. He says, much modern homosexuality is an expression of the current denial of antithesis. It has led to, in this case, to an obliteration of the distinction between man and woman. So the male and the female as complementary partners are finished. This is a form of homosexuality which is a part of the movement below the line of despair. In much modern thinking, all antithesis and all the order of God's creation is to be fought against, including the male-female distinction. But this is not an isolated problem. It is a part of the world spirit of the generation which surrounds us. It is imperative that Christians realize the conclusions which are being drawn as a result of the death of absolutes. End quote. Coffee break. And so this is exactly what happened in our culture. Schaeffer goes on to describe how this despair crept into other disciplines like poetry, cinema, popular music. And the unifying factor between all these disciplines is the way they represent how one comes to knowledge. So they use this Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And this outward dialectic can take many forms, but the real crux of the matter isn't the specific medium through which you're receiving the information. It's the system of thought itself that lies behind the medium. So that's super important. Schaeffer also demonstrates this principle in political and worldview systems. He speaks specifically about Senegal, who at that time, when Schaeffer was writing, had a president who wrote a book on African socialism. And he basically said that he can't agree fully with Marxism because its presuppositions led to the destruction of mankind as a whole, like as a meaningful being. But he agreed more closely with this liberal Roman Catholic thinker named Teilhard de Chardin. This is a really interesting thing, and this is what the president was saying, is that the thinking of Marx and the thinking of this liberal modern Roman Catholic were essentially the same. That's basically what the president of Senegal was saying in his book. And those two, Marx and Chardin, de Chardin, I don't know what to call him, they use different language, but the thought system by which they drew their conclusions was the same. That's really interesting. They both use the dialectical of synthesis. But there is a bright spot in all of this for the Christian. If the current form of thought is maintained, then people lose hope in their own position and their own way of thinking. The more consistent they are with it, the more they're going to lose hope in their own position because they're living in God's universe. Now, that means that we don't have to tear down as much false optimism when we present them with a reason to have genuine optimism. And so there isn't as much of the idea of humanity finally pulling himself out of the muck and the mire that he finds himself in. People no longer believe that's possible. So the Christian has the opportunity to fill the void with real, genuine hope that comes from the gospel. We can accurately diagnose humanity's problem and give them the God-given solution, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so when we do this with love, people are going to be more willing to listen because they don't have that false hope. We can more easily inject the true hope. So that's part one. I'll do part two soon. It'll be probably about this same length. So thanks for watching. Please watch the second part too. The second part is my favorite part of this book. Have a good one.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful for you and for growing in your relationship with God. If you are a college student in between the ages of 18 and 26, we want to invite you to join us on campus for our weekly meeting. If you want to see more videos like this about how to grow in your relationship with God, go ahead and click this video icon up here and it'll take you to a link to another video. Also, I want to remind you not to forget to subscribe to the Challenge channel by clicking on the Challenge logo right down here. Thanks, guys.